On the recent the energy crisis, the energy crunch, the vast Russian oil fields, the support, our relationship with them. Any observations you might have in that area?
The energy crisis, so far as I can see it, is a phony. Take a look at the Department of Commerce, U.S. Statistical Abstract Reserves of Natural Gas in the United States. You find they've increased by 50% since 1950. I think this year's output of natural gas is about 7% of total reserves. We have twice as much gas in the ground in the United States as has been produced in the whole history of production of natural gas going back to the late 19th century. What caused the apparent shortage, you go back to the Natural Gas Act of 1938, which gave the government the right to intervene. You take the 1954 Phillips Petroleum decision, which put a ceiling on natural gas prices, and of course this reduced incentive for natural gas producers to produce the gas, so you get a shortage. Anytime you interfere with a laissez-faire economy, you're going to get problems. This natural gas shortage was created, obviously, by government interference. Crude oil, I wrote a paper back in '69 in which I predicted almost exactly what has happened. I'm going to have to dig that paper up. I even predicted, I think, the Libyan situation. So, I mean, I've got actual empirical proof that my projection was right there, that we should have lifted import quotas a long time ago. That covers you two main. Of course, then you've got the environmentalists as well.
But this heavy influx of American technology now being talked about to the Russian area, so we will develop the field, we'll put together the refineries. Is this another similar to the steel business?
Well, yes, but the estimates are that Siberian natural gas is going to cost about anywhere between 2 and 4 times as much as Texas gas. It can only be done if you get credits from the Import-Export Bank, and I presume that will be done. It is a parallel to the situation of the 1930s. There's little question about that. It makes us dependent on Soviet gas. There's supposed to be mutual dependency, but look at it this way. Supposing the Soviets don't like us making a noise, for example, about Soviet Jews. They just turn the taps and cut off the gas. We're left high and dry without gas. Sure, we're dependent on them. But what about if we ship technology in there? They can use that for 20 years, for 30 years. You can't just pull that technology back. In other words, what we've committed ourselves is to a very wonderful thing. In other words, that our shipment of technology there is vital to them and is irreversible. But what they ship back is reversible in the sense they can cut it off anytime they want to. So we get absolutely the worst end of the deal. There's no question about that. By the way, on the SALT treaty, talking about bad deals, that one, I've got a little section on that. That one is almost unbelievable. Each country, Soviet Union and the United States, gets 2 ABM systems, and each capital country gets 1 system, and they can put the other system anywhere they want. So the American system goes in Washington, and the Soviet system goes in Moscow. But what have you got in Washington? If there was a threat of nuclear attack, you evacuate the bureaucrats, and all you got left is a lot of stones and waste paper. So, all right, drop all the bombs you want on it. But what if you got in Moscow? You've got the most important section of the military-industrial complex. Their main plants are in Moscow. So what you've exchanged here, it must have been brilliant to bring this about. You've exchanged defense of nothing for defense of the most significant part of the Soviet military-industrial structure. Now, I can't think of anything much crazier than that. I'm sorry I got off the track, but it just reminded me of that one. Yes, sir.
On what basis do you say that, or do you assume that we all divide everything into right and left?
Excuse me, sir. I did not. The question is, by the way, on what I said about right and left. Excuse me. I did not mean to imply that that you were individually doing it. Frankly, how I usually use that is not in relation to American political parties at all. It frankly doesn't enter into the picture here. Where I think it's got to be used is in a broader scale, where you're talking about national socialism on the right and international socialism being communism on the left. It's that broader political spectrum. In fact, Gary Allen in his book has got something very similar to what I'm saying, if not the same. He's got that spectrum, and I think Gary in his book says that the left-right spectrum is misleading. You've got to look at it in terms of a degree of centralization of power, which is exactly what I'm trying to say. Those two little diagrams in Gary Allen's book are exactly what I'm trying to say. Yes?
I have a question about how can we take a position of complete free trade?
No, please don't. You've made me think that perhaps we're further along the road than I thought. See, I'm at the end of a research project. And the conclusion in my mind is we're not going to solve this thing by clamping down on trade. I think we can do it with more information. Now, that's a long, long way from developing policy. What are we going to do? And there's got to be all kinds of discussion between what I've arrived at and where you actually go. Maybe we can't do it just by opening up the files. Maybe we've got to clamp down on trade. In other words, my mind is wide open. But the point is I'm at the end of a research stage, and I have these ideas developed. But this is a long way. If you're thinking in terms of resolutions, no, please. I mean, let's get some policy out of this. And this thing's now got to be kicked around and see, where do you go from here? It may be you'll have to cut off trade but fire the bureaucrats you've got and get some you can trust. Maybe that's the way to go. Next step is definitely information. In other words, hold as you are with trade. Hold with the clamping down on trade as a temporary position. But don't commit yourself to it for 50 years, I would suggest. But information is vital. You've got to find out what kind of deals have been made with the Soviet Union. That's vital. Because I suspect the worst. I suspect they've sold the thing out just lock, stock, and barrel. Now, that's my suspicion. Yes, sir. Operation Keelhaul was 1945, 1946, where I don't know how many, at least several 100,000 Russians who were then in Europe were forced to go back to the Soviet Union. They were forced by American and British troops to go back, and there are still graves in Austria on the bank of the River Drava of 142 Russians who committed suicide rather than go back to the Soviet Union. Now, this was a flagrant violation of the Geneva Convention, because paragraph 33 of the Geneva Convention just flatly does not allow you to force someone back when he doesn't want to go. You can claim political exile. And so these people probably ended up in Siberia. We're still doing it. If you think of the Lithuanian seaman Kuderka, who jumped from a Soviet ship to an American Coast Guard cutter in American territorial waters just 2 years ago, and the Coast Guard commander, under instructions from Washington, allowed the Soviets to come on board an American naval vessel in U.S. territorial waters. They beat the Lithuanian sailor and dragged him back on the Soviet ship. That's another flagrant violation. Now, I'd like to see the papers on that. Anyone? You're the only one, Ron. Oh, excuse me. That was Epstein, Julius Epstein. I don't think he's there any longer. Julius Epstein has spent many years, 15 years, working on that. He knows more about it than anybody else. I came into it because I could see what he was doing. He was doing in that what I was trying to do in Western technology, so every chance I get, I just mention it to make sure that as many people as possible know about it. But he is the man on Operation Keelhaul. Yes?
Do you think that the present hearings of Watergate and the grand jury indictments and the special investigator and all this, do you think this is going to lead to any declassification?
I'm not optimistic. I know Mr. Nixon has said that this is going to be an open administration. open information. But he also said the taxes weren't going to be raised and a number of other things. In other words, I don't think that they will change one little bit until they are forced to change. And it is going to take a great deal of public pressure through Congress. I just do not think they're going to change voluntarily, for good reason. I have read something like over 10, 15 years, perhaps 250,000 State Department documents, either read or scanned them. And if that material had come out at the time, for example, Colonel House cabling Wilson at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution suppressed criticism of the Bolsheviks in American newspapers. If that had come out in 1917, imagine the uproar that would have created. And I think the same thing is going on today. I don't know, but I suspect. I don't think they will do it voluntarily. I think it's going to take a great deal of public effort. But I do think it is vitally important. Yes, sir?
What makes you think the documents will be intact?
There are examples of policy being used in that manner. In other words, if you want to bring about something, you've got to have a kind of a wall to batter up against to bring it about. It's the Marxian, thesis and antithesis brings about a synthesis. There is no question in my mind that the so-called international bankers are very much in the middle of this thing. There is a group, I call it the establishment. It seems to be a transatlantic establishment, and I know that because I have English sources. There's a transatlantic link, there's no question about this. It pretty well controls policy, there's no question about that. Whether you call yourself a Republican or a Democrat, the same people. Look, Kissinger was under Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. They're pretty well running the show. But it's going to take an awful lot more work to get the full picture out. I don't think we've scraped the surface. But what I do know, look, basically I'm a researcher. This is my job. I'm a technician. I do know there is a much bigger picture, and the picture I've got is only a little part of it. There's a lot more under the surface. No question about that. Do you want to...